Started. I see that people are still entering, but yeah, I think it has slowed down. Welcome everyone to our very first webinar in our Music4Pain Research Network webinar series. We are super excited to be launching this webinar series that is aimed at improving the quality of mechanistic research studies related to music for pain management, as well as looking at hypothesized or taking a deeper dive into hypothesized mechanisms for how we think music helps with pain management. So very fitting to the purpose of this network and the name of our research network, we are starting with a focus on music selection. And we are really, really thrilled to have Dr. Mathieu Roy and Dr. Andrea Hunt as our inaugural speakers for this inaugural webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I introduce them and before I hand it over to them, I just would like to remind everyone that we have a very exciting opportunity coming up in our network, and that is our Visiting Scholars Program. You can read more about it on our website, but I just wanted to alert everyone that this is a fantastic opportunity for undergraduate, graduate, PhD, medical students, and so on, to gain hands-on experience in mechanistic research related to music for pain. The deadline for applications, which is a very, very easy application process, is coming up really soon, October 30th. So if you know any students, if you are a student who would like to get some fantastic experience in leading research labs, please do go check this out on our website. You can take a scan here of the QR code and get more information. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Mathieu Roy. Dr. Mathieu Roy is a co-investigator of our Music for Pain Research Network. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at McGill University. He is a neuropsychologist who specializes in how the brain encodes pain experiences and the role of music in pain reduction. His research has used brain imaging techniques to identify pain markers and is innovative really in looking at how music might help with chronic pain management. And I will introduce our second speaker already as well, so that we can then just move from one to the next in our presentation today. Dr. Andrea Hunt is the director of the music therapy program at Rowan University. Dr. Hunt integrates neuroscience and trauma responsive frameworks to support music therapy training. Her research focuses on developing accessible music-based interventions for chronic pain using advanced physiological measures. So again, welcome and thank you so much for accepting our invitation to present your important work and knowledge and wisdom with all of us in this webinar. So Dr. Roy, over to you.
Thank you, Yoka. So I'm trying to, okay, perfect. So here is a brief outline of the presentation that I've prepared for you today. So I'm going to start with a short introduction about why we need to study the effects of music on pain in the laboratory. And then I will examine some of the experimental constraints that we have on the selection of the duration of the musical excerpts that we use in our experiments. So here I will have to warn you, this may not be the most exciting part of the presentation, but this will give a good idea of the problems that we're dealing with in the laboratory for those of you who are not familiar with that type of research. And then finally, I'll get into the heat of the topic, and we will discuss what are the active ingredients of music. Sorry, there's a little lag. All right, so why do we need to study the effects of music on pain in the laboratory? Well, if we want to understand the mechanisms underlying the effects of music on pain, we need to carefully manipulate specific variables while controlling for others. and we can only reach this level of precision by bringing the problem back to the laboratory. So this is the main reason why in medicine, for instance, we use rodent models to study pain or other clinical conditions. However, one problem with non-human models in research on pain is that it is unclear if non-human animals really perceive music the same way that we do. And so one thing that we can do is study the problem in the human equivalent of the laboratory rat, which is the undergraduate psychology student. So we bring people in the lab and we can administer painful stimuli. So this is a participant from one of our earlier studies. This is my hand there holding the thermal stimulator on the foot. So we administer pain while the participant is listening to different types of music. And we can record all bunch of measures. So here you can see that he has electrodes placed on his face to record facial EMG. So this is something that we can only do in the laboratory. Oops. All right, so another important question to ask ourselves when we're doing experimental research is what type of mechanism we're after. So I'm personally interested in understanding how the brain produces the subjective experience of pain and how music might affect that process. We use all sorts of brain imaging techniques like fMRI, and so when I'm designing an experiment, I always have that end goal in mind. As I was saying, one of the big advantages of doing research in the laboratory is that you can carefully control the nociceptive stimulus, so the stimulus that's producing pain. There is an important distinction to be made between pain, which is defined as the unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage, and nociception, which refer to the neural processes of encoding noxious stimuli. So while most of the time there is a strong correlation between nociception and pain, they're not the same thing. And we think that music affects the process by which nociception leads to pain. And here on the right, we see a brief outline of pain processing pathways. And you can see that there are many relays. It's not that straightforward. So pain enters, first of all, nociceptive information enters the spinal cord, makes the first relay there on spinal projection neurons that project nociceptive information to the brainstem and then to the thalamus, and from the thalamus to the cortex where the pain experience is being generated. And on the right, you can see that the brain also has the capacity to gate or modulate the influx of nociceptive input to the brain. So there are also descending pathways that will affect how much nociceptive information is transmitted from the spinal cord to the brain. So logically, we think that music should affect pain by acting on these ascending and descending pathways, and laboratory experiments allow us to carefully control the nociceptive input, leaving us to figure out what's happening in the rest of the system. All right, so now let's discuss some of the experimental constraints that we have on the selection of excerpt duration. So one big problem when you conduct experiments like that and you repeatedly administer painful thermal stimuli. So most of the time, the type of stimulus that we will use is heat. And that's because heat selectively activates nociceptive fibers. So one problem that we have very often when repeatedly stimulating a patch of skin with heat is that it will produce a habituation and or sensitization. So habituation is the decrease in pain that results from repeated stimulation, and sensitization is the opposite. So the increase in pain following repeated stimulation. So here is just an example of an experiment to illustrate habituation and sensitization. So in this experiment, what they did was to stimulate 8 different patches of skin on the forearm at different temperatures, and they repeated that 3 times, so across 3 blocks. And what we see below are the temperature adjusted pain ratings as a function of the trial number. So the pain ratings controlling for the temperature that was administered. And the idea here is that any fluctuation in pain that occurs within a block has to result from central processes underlying habituation and sensitization. So processes that occur either at the level of the spinal cord or higher up at the level of the brain. However, any differences in pain ratings that occur between blocks are probably more the result of peripheral mechanisms, because the same patch of skin is being repeatedly stimulated across these 3 different blocks. And so what we can see here, first of all, during the first block is that regardless of temperature, pain will gradually increase and reach some sort of a ceiling, okay? And because these effects are related to stimulation that is administered on different patches of skin, we can say that these effects are non-site specific and therefore probably reflect a central sensitization mechanism. So pain gradually increases and then reaches a ceiling. But then the other thing that we can see is that across the different blocks, we can see a gradual decrease in pain as the same stimulus site is being stimulated, which indicate the presence of a site-specific or peripheral habituation. Okay, so this is just to illustrate some of the kinds of effects that we'll get by repeatedly stimulating a given participant. And there are many, many causes for these habituation and sensitization effects. So non-site specific or central effects may be due to the habituation or sensitization of spinal projection neuron, to changes in descending inhibition or facilitation, to fluctuations in attention, to expectations, to sequential effects in magnitude ratings, etc. Whereas site-specific or peripheral effects may be due to habituation and sensitization at the level of the nociceptor, so the peripheral nerve fiber that's encoding the nociceptive stimulus. So when we design an experiment, we have to deal with these habituation and sensitization effects. And so one way to do this is to quickly alternate between short experimental conditions. And this is what we see on the right. So for instance, an ideal design for looking at the effects of music versus a controlled condition would be to have very short excerpts and to quickly alternate between them. It's also important to have several orders of presentation and then randomize the orders between participants. And it's also important to move across different stimulation sites to try to control for peripheral sensitization. And finally, statistical techniques can be also used to covary out these sequential effects. All right, so another issue is with the use of subjective ratings to measure pain. So there is this idea that pain is whatever the patient says it is. And of course, this is very important to consider in clinical practice. We don't want to deny patients treatment because we distrust their pain reports. But in an experimental setting, this is not completely true. Okay, so more generally in psychophysics, the model that we have is that there is a subjective pain percept that is being reported by the participant through pain ratings, but there are many biases in reporting this pain experience that are independent from the pain that the participant really experiences. So more specifically, I'd like to focus on two related problems. So the first one is that simply asking people to rate their pain may change the experience of pain itself. Okay, so maybe normally participants would have listened to the music, would have been fully immersed to the music, but then you're changing the task by asking the participant to pay attention to their pain, right? So maybe you're kind of like ruining the effects of music right there by asking participants to rate their pain. And that's a problem that's difficult to circumvent. But one thing that you can do is to ask for pain ratings later on, sort of like after the fact. However, that also comes with certain problems. So now the problem is that the pain rating relies on mnemonic processes. And so the further away the pain rating from the actual pain experience, the more bias that people may have in how they recall the pain. And then also all of a sudden it becomes uncertain if the effects of music are related to the effects of music on pain perception per se, or if these are effects that are influencing how pain is being remembered. So it's also tricky to use a posteriori pain ratings. And so a good compromise is to administer painful stimuli towards the end of the musical excerpt such that you minimize the time between the pain rating and the administration of the painful excerpts. So these effects related to subjective pain ratings and the use of memory to recall your pain also converge towards a simple design like the one that we have on the top right, where the music and the control condition quickly alternate. So that's a design that's optimal for measuring pain. However, it's not necessarily a design that is optimal for music. So there is this idea that musical emotions take time to build up and unfold. And so it may not be optimal to use very short musical stimuli. And there is also a risk that the emotional state that is being induced by music endures a little bit in time and then leaks out in the next musical excerpt. So this is what I've displayed on the bottom right here. And so one problem is if you alternate too fast between the different experimental conditions, everything gets diffused, mixed up, etc. And so a compromise could be to use kind of like longer musical stimuli and administer several painful stimulation in them. So this is what I have on the bottom right, but it's unclear. We lack data regarding exactly what's the optimal design, but for those of you designing experiments, it's an important trade-off to consider. So should we use shorter musical excerpts and alternate rapidly? This is optimal from a pain perspective, or shall we use longer musical excerpts and not alternate as much? So this would be more optimal from music's perspective. All right, so that's all for this first part of the presentation. So now let's get in the heat of the topic. So what are the active ingredients of music? So we can all probably agree that the hypoalgesic effects of music are related to music's emotional impact. And so when considering musical emotions, one important distinction to make is between the emotions that we feel when we listen to music versus the emotion that can be recognized in music. So when I started my PhD in Isabel Perez's lab, so a big music cognition lab, a lot of the research that was being conducted there was to try to understand the impact of brain lesions on the capacity to recognize emotions in music. So we would be using very simplified musical excerpts that were very prototypical of different musical emotions like sadness and happiness. And one of the things that Isabel had found was that it takes very little time for people to distinguish sadness from happiness. Okay, so this is what we see here on the right. So the y-axis are happy, sad ratings, and on the x-axis, we see how long it takes for people to recognize these emotions in music. And what is very surprising is that it may take as little as 250 milliseconds to recognize happiness or sadness. So as long as you can process the mode and the tempo of the music, you can identify the correct emotion. But arguably, people probably feel very little emotion when listening to these stripped down musical excerpts. So the first experiment of my PhD, unfortunately, unpublished data, failed experiment, was to try to look at the effects of these types of musical excerpts on pain, and we didn't find any difference. So this suggested that what's important is not the emotion that people recognize, but probably the emotion that people feel while listening to music. And so this led us to our next experiment, which was also a failure, but in retrospect, a very interesting one. So for that second experiment, we were still hung up on this sad and happy distinction in music, but because it's a very easy distinction to have with music. So sadness and happiness are two main emotions that are very easy to convey with music. So in that next experiment, we asked participants to bring in their favorite happy and sad music to the lab. And what we found was that both new types of musics were effective in reducing pain compared to silence, but there were no differences between sad and happy music. And that's probably due to the fact that sadness in music is perceived as pleasant. People like listening to pleasant music. And this is what we see on the right here. So when considering musical emotions, there is this tension between two theoretical frameworks. So the first one is primary emotion. So the categories of emotions that people feel when they listen to music. So happiness, sadness are a good example. Their music can also be scary or perceived as peaceful. So those are the primary emotions that people feel when listening to music. And by contrast, we also have emotional dimensions such as balance. So is the music pleasant or unpleasant? Arousal, is the music relaxing or stimulating? And so those are two different ways to look at the music. On the right, what we can see here is that these two ways of looking at music can also be reconciled. So the primary emotions induced by music can be placed in a two-dimensional space. So what that second failed experiment revealed is that probably the primary emotions induced by music are not particularly important. Probably it's more the balance of the emotion that's induced that's important. And also, just a little note, it may be interesting to keep in mind that sad music is pleasant. People like listening to sad music. And here I just wanted to recommend a very good book that I've recently read on the topic, Bittersweet by Susan Cain, which changed the way I conceived of sadness, especially in music. Anyway, so in that third iteration, so this was our first success to get a statistically significant difference between two musical conditions. In this third experiment, we selected musical excerpts to be judged by a majority of participants as being either very pleasant or very unpleasant, controlling for the level of arousal. So while our participants listened to these different types of musical excerpts, we administered thermal stimulations. We had 4 temperatures. 3 of them were in the painful range. 1 was non-painful. And then after each thermal stimulation, participants had to rate the pain that they felt on scales of intensity and unpleasantness if the stimulation was painful, and on a scale of warmth if the stimulation was non-painful. And these were, sorry. All right. And these were our results, which revealed a strong effects of valence. So on the left, we have pain intensity on top, pain unpleasantness below. On the right, we have warmth ratings for the non-painful stimulation. On the left, we have the 3 levels of painful stimulations from the left to the right. In white, we have the unpleasant music. In black, silence. In gray, the pleasant music. And you can see that the only difference with silence is for the pleasant music. So the emotion that is induced by music is what seems to be important to explain its analgesic effect. And what seems to matter here is really more of an effect of valence. In a subsequent experiment, we tried to look a little bit more into the mechanisms underlying this effect. And there we focused on this idea that music could produce descending modulation of spinal nociception. So here, in order to measure spinal nociception, we measured the amplitude of a spinally mediated reflex called the nociceptive flexion reflex that can be induced by administering painful electrical stimulation to the ankle and recording the biceps femoris EMG contraction that results from that stimulation. So it's a reflex that's designed to withdraw the affected limb from the nociceptive stimulus. So here we use the same kind of musical excerpts. We added pleasant and relaxing music because this is typically what has been used in a lot of music therapy studies, and we wanted to see if relaxing music had an advantage. And on the right here, we see the effects of these different types of excerpts on pain ratings and nociceptive flexion reflex amplitude. And what we can see is, again, a strong balance effect. So pain ratings and the reflex amplitude are increased for the unpleasant music compared to the pleasant excerpts. And there was also a non-significant difference between pleasant stimulating and pleasant relaxing music, but a difference that is in the direction of an advantage for relaxing music. And later on in later experiments, we do get statistical differences between pleasant stimulating and pleasant relaxing music. So I'll get to those studies in the next slides. All right, so more recently, we wanted to revisit the effects of emotional dimensions on the effects of music on pain. And there, what we did was to use a framework of musical dimensions related to music that was developed by a colleague, David Greenberg. So what David did was to ask hundreds of participants to rate hundreds of musical excerpts on these emotional qualifiers. And then he used a principal component analysis to extract the underlying emotional dimensions. And what he found was that there were three main components. The first one is arousal, so relaxing, stimulating. The second one was valence, which could be split into valence and depth. So valence here isn't the pleasant, unpleasant dimension that I discussed earlier. It's more related to this sad, happy distinction that is very strong with music. And depth here refers to music that is judged by participants to be sophisticated, inspiring, complex, etc. So depth refers more to the aesthetic qualities of music. So in order to look at the impact of these three emotional dimensions, we used excerpts in David's corpus of musical excerpts and systematically varied arousal, depth, and balance. So this is a study that was done by my student Darius Valevicius, and we did it twice. So in the first study, first of all, we saw a difference between music compared to silence and a scrambled music control condition. And when we looked at the effects of these three emotional dimensions, we found effects for all three dimensions. So relaxing music, sad music, and music that is deep was found to be optimal in that first study here. In the second study, we more or less replicated the same design with different excerpts, and we replicated more or less the same results. The only result that didn't replicate was the effect of balance. So here we didn't find any advantage for sad music, but we found again that relaxing and deep music seemed to be optimal. All right, so it seems that musical pleasure, musical pleasantness is what seems to be driving a lot of these effects. One way to optimize music pleasantness is to ask people to bring in the music that they enjoy listening to the most. So here on the right, we have the results of a meta-analysis conducted by Eduardo Garza Villarreal that shows that there seems to be an advantage for self-selected preferred music. And so we wanted to see if we could find the same effect in the laboratory. So we asked participants to bring in their favorite music and compared it to silence or to experimenters selected relaxing music. And what we found was that self-selected preferred music or favorite music, so the light blue bar here, is what produced the strongest hypoalgesic effect compared to the relaxing music, silence, or their scrambled control conditions. And that was particularly interesting for us because it pointed towards the reward system as a potential mechanism for the effects of music on pain. So using the same kind of procedure, so asking people to bring in their favorite music, my colleague Robert Zatorre had found that music pleasantness, or more specifically, the musical chills that some people may experience in response to certain passages in music, musical chills are associated with dopamine release in the brain rewards system, so the nucleus accumbens here. So this is we're currently testing the hypothesis that this could be mediating the effects of music on pain in an fMRI experiment. And here, one thing to consider is perhaps to match the timing of the painful stimuli to the moments in the music where the pleasure is highest. So we do this in 2 rounds. So before the scanning experiment, we ask people to continuously rate the pleasure that they experience when they listen to their favorite pieces of music. And this is what we see on the right. And then we can identify these peak moments. And we use that to time the presentation of our painful stimuli for the fMRI experiment. All right, so I'll try to conclude rapidly. All All right. Okay. So maybe very rapidly, one last experiment on the effects of tempo. This is an experiment that we did with my colleague Karen Palmer and her student Wembo Yi. So here, more specifically, we looked at the effects of the spontaneous production rate. So people reliably differ in the rhythm that they will use to perform all sorts of tasks, like a tapping task here. So we bring people in the lab, we ask them to tap at a rhythm that they feel is the most comfortable. And here on the right, we see these inter-tap interval for the 60 participants that were enrolled in this study. So there is variability between subject variability, but within individual, people are pretty consistent with the rate at which they prefer to tap. And here we hypothesize that music would have more effects if it was presented at the participant's spontaneous production rate versus slower or faster. So we modified musical excerpts to be presented exactly at the participant's spontaneous production rate, or faster and or slower. And we found that the highest analgesic effects were found for music that was presented at the spontaneous production rate, suggesting some sort of entrainment mechanism that is optimal when you present music at that very specific tempo. So this suggests perhaps another mechanism different from musical pleasure that may underlie the effects of tempo and or arousal induced by music. So I apologize for taking a little bit more time than that was allotted to me. Thank you for your attention, and I'd like to thank the funding agencies and my colleagues. So thank you, and Andy, I'm passing the baton to you.
And before we go to Andy, we do have a moment to answer a good question that was posted. And please, I forgot to mention at the start of our webinar, please post your questions in the Q&A function, and I am monitoring those. We'll answer a few questions for Mathieu now. So if you have additional questions about this presentation, feel free to enter them. Then we'll have Andy present, and we'll answer some questions specific to Andy's presentation. And then with whatever time we have left, we'll open it up to further Q&A. So here is a question, Dr. Roy. When patients brought their sad music to the lab, were these songs that caused sadness and brought them to tears? So this person is wondering if the release or crying could lead to pain intensity increasing momentarily, but having an overall reduction after the release. So I don't know if you've ever had participants come to the lab who actually were brought to tears by the music.
No, I didn't personally see anyone crying when they listened to these excerpts. And yeah, generally what we found was a pretty strong reduction in pain ratings. This was one of my first studies. So in retrospect, the amplitude of the effects we got were quite high. And it were interesting, but yeah, in the moment it felt like a failed experiment. But that would be certainly something to study more in depth. But my prediction would be that regardless of actual crying or not, this would be associated with a pretty strong analgesia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Very interesting question. Here's another good one. I mean, all of your questions are good, of course, but I find it very interesting. Would the familiarity enter the prediction mechanisms associated with preferred and familiar music compared to control stimuli influence pain levels? Specifically, how might the emotional and cognitive responses elicited by familiar music alter individuals' perceptions of pain in contrast to neutral or unfamiliar stimuli? So this is a question about the role of familiarity with music.
Yeah. So this is maybe related to some of the slides that I've skipped. So asking people to select music of course, will probably produce very strong effects, but it comes at a cost. And the cost is that we're not controlling for familiarity, and we're also not controlling for the added sense of control that participant may get from choosing their own musical excerpts. So Robert Zatori did a lot of work to control for familiarity. And one of the things that he's done that could also be done for research with music is to use AI algorithms to guess the type of music that people would enjoy listening to based on their the preferred music that they brought to the lab, right? So it's not exactly the same musical excerpt, but is an excerpt that, you know, the algorithm thinks that the person would like listening to. And this in large part controls for familiarity. That being said, familiarity or some level of familiarity may be intrinsically linked to the enjoyment of music. So the idea of the link between music and activity in the reward system is that this release of dopamine in the reward system is related to the generation of prediction errors. So when we listen to music, when we really get into the music, our auditory system is predicting the next note, right? The next what's going to happen. And when those predictions are better than and when the music is actually better than what we predicted, the brain generates a reward prediction error. So what that means is that our auditory system needs to be able to form these predictions, and so in a sense it has to understand the music that it's listening to. So music that is completely unfamiliar won't produce these prediction errors because people have a hard time forming these predictions, right? Conversely, music that is extremely, extremely familiar, so you listen to the same musical excerpts 100 times in a row, won't produce these prediction errors because the predictions are entirely fulfilled. So probably enjoyment is kind of in between. And yeah, this is what happens when we go into phases of listening to a specific type of music that at first is a bit new to us, and we're discovering it. And then after a while, we're fed up and we switch to other kinds of music. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. There are some more interesting questions coming in, but I'm first going to give Dr. Hunt the opportunity to now present on this topic of music selection from a more clinical perspective. And then hopefully we can get to the rest of the questions as well. If not, we can find also another way to answer these questions, get these questions to you. And somebody has asked Dr. Roy, and this will be relevant for you too, Dr. Hunt, if links to the studies that you mentioned can be shared with them. And we will absolutely send out via email to all of attendees the links to the research that was mentioned. So Dr. Hunt, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Yoka. And thank you, Matthew. We could, I'm sure, talk all day because this is all really fascinating. And I greatly appreciate Yoka, you inviting us together because they think these are really important conversations to cross our disciplines because, you know, we need to share this knowledge and work in a really integrated way. It's something we really need. So my perspective coming as a clinician, I am losing control of the slides. Where are we? Here we go. You know, it was interesting to me hearing Matthew's presentation talking, you know, trying to understand pain in the laboratory to control pain, right? Means you have to create pain there in that controlled situation. And working clinically with patients with chronic pain, we're at the other end of the spectrum, dealing with patients where we don't know what's the origin of their pain. Sometimes it could be neuropathic pain, it could be psychological pain and mood impacting that pain experience. So we really do have to believe the patient's report of pain. What is pain for them? And then we have to also look at what is music. We are, as music therapists, working with patients. We are musicians. We come with a lot of knowledge of psychology and medicine, and working at integrating those disciplines to bring music with our patients, participants, clients, for their well-being, for their healing, right? And that may mean not just listening to music, which is kind of the bedrock of, well, most of the research in this area, right? We are just listening to excerpts of music, recorded music, but we are creating music with clients because we are musicians. We are bringing in musical instruments of various kinds. We are maybe singing and creating music with our bodies. Adding a lot more complexity to this situation. So yeah, it is a super complex system we're working with, not to mention, all of the other factors that might impact that patient, socially, economically, spiritually as well. So, when I'm talking as a music therapist, I want to understand, what do we mean when we're talking about music selection in mechanistic research? Some of the interventions we've seen for music interventions for pain include music and imagery, where we might have recorded music playing. It's selected perhaps with the assistance of the client to determine what kind of music they want. It could be relaxing in nature, it could be a little more energetic, and it could be, we're guiding the patient through a meditative experience to imagine being someplace else, or imagine the state of their body feeling differently. That's one whole area of practice. And then we could improvise music with a patient, improvise music that is meant to change how they're feeling or to match how they're feeling and shift it in a new way, using all kinds of instruments or voices. We could have clients bring in songs, talk about a song that's meaningful to them, a song that expresses something important to them, and maybe in relationship to their pain or other people related to their needs. And we could have group singing, and the whole group dynamic is also quite important in a pain context, which I'll talk about in some studies in the forthcoming slides, because pain can be very isolating, right? You could feel quite alone in your body dealing with pain. And of course, from a music therapist's perspective, we do also work with people who want to listen to music on their own, self-administered music listening for pain management. So it could be music for relaxation, but there's also been some great scoping reviews about, people also choose music to activate themselves, to help them through painful situations. They want to exercise. They want to get up and get about doing their daily routine. So, we can also support people in selecting music for those purposes. When we're not always around. As a clinician, we can't be with somebody 24/7, but people might want to find a way to just use music themselves. So, the thing is, when you're dealing, as I said, with all these like complex circumstances, choosing music for mechanistic research can be really difficult. And something I know Matthew alluded to, but is that, you've got all these neurological differences with, repeated music presentations that might lead to habituation. And does the whole piece of music like cause, a bleed over effect into, the analgesic properties you're hoping for and the pain stimuli? So, that is complicated. And I think as music therapists, we'd prefer to work with as whole music presentation as possible, as holistic as possible, because that's where we see meaning and effects happening in the clinic. And then I think there's a lot of individual variability in neurological responses too. My dissertation involved the use of neurophenomenology, which was really, drilling down into individual perception of, a subjective experience, and then looking to see what is neurologically happening at those moments. So a lot of our usual cognitive neuroscience research is looking for a collective difference, right? A large sample size, large numbers of participants, and then seeing where those differences are. but it would be, from a music therapist perspective, we are very concerned with the individual differences. What is really happening uniquely with that person, given their unique context. And of course, in music therapy, we see, we've got human interaction as a major mechanism. We see that the interpersonal relationship is very important. And music is not an external object that we give to people. It is something we co-create. It is something that is also culturally situated. The fact that this song means something to you is because you inherited it through your culture, you inherited it through a familial relationship or a friend relationship or, a cultural experience. It's not isolated, right? So all of those layers of meaning and interrelatedness, and then, or even the music we co-create in a session has that interpersonal component that's important. So how do you put all of that in an fMRI scanner, right? That is a big challenge. So trying to come up with a way that can honor that clinical reality is challenging with neuroimaging, where you have to control for so much in a lab experience. And I also want to highlight how we have, as clinicians, we are ethically bound to be trauma-informed, work with a trauma-centered perspective. If we are working with clients who might have traumatic medical histories due to the nature of disease or illness, having them go into a lab with an fMRI scanner might be intimidating. How do we manage that? How do we help them deal with that situation? And also, even how do we help them select music that is going to be beneficial for them? There might be music interventions that could actually bring up or try to amplify the pain experience in an attempt to shift it. How do we do that in a way that is trauma-informed and safe for people? So, and the other real challenge as music therapists is we might have a protocol to follow for the clinical trial, but what if that doesn't meet the client's needs in the moment? We want the flexibility to meet clients' needs, to choose different music if that's what's indicated for the client at that time, to shift the music or make it meet the most important moments. So these are all the kind of things that go through a music therapist's mind when I talk with my colleagues about mechanistic research. And I think a lot of folks are wondering, how can we do this that can be clinically informative? Because what we really want is to see pain relief for our clients, right? So here are a few examples I'm going to highlight, in today's presentation that I think are doing a good job at that, like looking at understanding mechanisms, but using things as ecologically valid and as clinically relevant as possible. So I'm going to highlight Dr. Brott's work and also a recent publication by Mingyong Lo with Dr. Brott, where it was group vocal toning and improvisation. I'll describe that in a minute. And then focusing more on the cognitive and behavioral mechanisms. So we're not actually studying what's happening in the moment with patients, but reports, self-reports of their benefits of the intervention. A paper I published with Dr. Jörg Fachner, using EEG to look at specific brain responses to different music interventions for pain. And then some possibilities for an approach called social neuroscience, where we could work with improvised music in the moment, in vivo. It's not been used with pain just yet, so I'll correct myself there, but I think there is a lot of potential in the future. So this first work with looking at psychosocial mechanisms using improvised vocal music therapy, something I didn't catch in my first reading of this study, but I did in preparation for this session, was the point that Dr. Brott made that active music making used in this study maps onto several of the healing mechanisms hypothesized to be active in many African-American churches. It's the idea that this social, spiritual context to a group of people who are attached to a shared cultural identity can be a mechanism, right? And we can harness that mechanism through creating this group experience using some of these music experiences, toning and humming, which is, the group singing on a single note and then adding some harmonies and building onto it. You know, verbal processing of what did that feel like, connecting cognitively to the body, improvising vocally, doing some circle songs, which could be improvised, call and response kind of things, more discussion. So again, integrating cognitively with the music experience, and then participant-led discussion. So the idea then, after a series of these, participants self-reporting what they gained and finding, you know, that self-efficacy was really important. People were using music on their own, reconnecting to music for themselves. But also social connection was also super important. These are mechanisms. They're not neurological mechanisms, but they are psychological and behavioral mechanisms that are important in how we can use music and harness these experiences for benefit. And this also aligns with some more hypothesized mechanisms by Claire Howland and Brendan Rooney about, you know, that self-efficacy, choosing music, and also being connected with other people is important in self-administered music listening. In the paper that I did with Jörg Faulkner, we focused on two different music interventions. One is entrainment, which was developed by Cheryl Dilio, and it is an improvisational method with pain patients, where you have a patient and a music therapist develop an improvised way of making music that makes the sound of a person's pain. If you can sonify someone's pain rhythmically, in terms of timbres, the tempo even of pain, the idea is that you then have the therapist play that pain music with the patient relaxing, the patient directs that music, and then the patient has also identified healing music. So you entrain psychologically, perhaps physiologically, with that pain music, and then the therapist shifts to healing music, music that will bring relief, comfort, a pleasurable experience. And we compared that intervention in a single session to another single session of music for relaxation. So these are pre-recorded music. It could have some nature sounds in it. It could have a version of a spiritual song, you know, in a jazz style, but the patient selected that music. And we had recordings of those sessions and brought them into an EEG lab and had 3 patients undergo EEG interventions, sessions to see what was going on neurologically. And so this was our block design. And the idea, the hypothesis here was that there are different attentional demands. When you're focusing on the pain, you are with the improvisation is helping you really stay quite connected to the pain, quite connected to your body, and then shifting to that healing music. Whereas with the relaxation music, you might even really try to disconnect or be distracted from the pain. And so we set up, you know, block design, and each of these blocks are relatively short. You know, we only had like 30 to 50 seconds of the pain music from an entrainment condition, and then back to back with their healing music of 60 to 90 seconds. And then the preferred music was the music listening of 60 to 90 seconds each patient. And then we contrasted that with other participants' entrainment music and music, preferred music. So they're short blocks, but that was because that's how long the patients needed the music to be. They were directing the therapist. They were indicating when to start and stop. And, you know, so we kind of had only really short bits to work with. So we were trying to provide equal lengths of blocks across the 3 patients we were working with. But again, this was all very driven by the participants. You know, what were they doing in the sessions? What kind of music did they want? When did they want it? And there are a lot of results, but I'm just going to highlight this main one that, you know, and obviously there needs to be more investigation into this, but, you know, one of the findings we discovered was that, you know, gamma coherence, so that's one of the EEG frequencies, it's the highest frequency, coherence meaning the amount of connection between regions of the brain. There was a lot of gamma coherence during one patient's pain music from the entrainment. And that seems to indicate, or could indicate, based on other research, that there might be more of a top-down, like a cognitive focus on the pain to help manage the pain. And this is different than more of the bottom-up type of processing where people are trying to distract themselves from pain. So this could be more like a cognitive coping mechanism using this entrainment music that's improvised with the music therapist. So we do see this top-down kind of processing in other types of things, not just music research, perhaps meditating, and that's with lab-based studies. But so we need to study this more, understand more what is unique about the music. What does the music do for this type of situation? Now, another really exciting way that we could preserve ecological validity and work with clinical music in this type of research is social neuroscience. So this is a screenshot from a BBC piece you can look up, and we can send a link out to with the other studies of Jörg Faulkner's work at Anglia Ruskin University. This is a gentleman with early onset dementia working with a music therapist. They're both wearing EEG caps, and they are simultaneously collecting EEG signal from both of them and looking specifically at the frontal regions of their brain, the alpha signal. And they're looking at to what degree each participant's alpha is stronger or weaker on each side. Those differences indicate positive and negative emotion in a very general sense. The idea, though, is in this method called hyperscanning is to what degree are they meeting each other moment by moment in the music? Are they following each other in that positive versus negative emotion while playing music? And so this can look like this. This is a study that Jörg Faulkner published on a guided imagery and music session. So it's a different type of intervention where you're playing music, classical music, while a patient or participant is in a meditative state, having imagery in response to usually classical excerpts of music. And it might be difficult for you to see, but the guide is the therapist, and the guide is in green, and up and down are the different directions of the frontal alpha signal, which one's stronger, which one's weaker. And the blue is the client, the traveler. And so you do see how the traveler is moving up and down, stronger, negative, stronger and weaker with the alpha asymmetry. And they're highlighting portions of the session here that both the participant and the therapist have identified as very meaningful. These were moments in the middle of the session where they both said something important happened here. I felt a strong connection with the therapist, with the music. And so they're not looking at the entire session. They're only focusing on the parts that people involved in the session identify as important. And so we do see, you know, a little bit of like leading and following with the traveler and the guide, the client leading the therapist in terms of the direction of the alpha asymmetry. And this is an approach that Dr. Faulkner is using and has worked with other researchers in developing as well. And so the idea that it almost doesn't even matter what kind of music it is, right? If you can work with the client and the therapist to identify specific moments in that interactive music clinical experience, and you have a specific outcome measure, such as say frontal alpha asymmetry, then you can drill down and look and see what's happening moment by moment in a micro-analysis. So if you go with the concept that the music experience is subjective and the pain experience is subjective, you're going to have to find a way to get those two to meet and study them. It is complicated. And so we also should look at the fact that self-efficacy seems to be really important as a mechanism, but it's also related with, you know, cognitive, affective, sensory, phenomenological experiences of music, right? And we need ecologically valid clinical research that can identify those music-based interventions. In the midst of all of that, we also have patients who are dealing with the communities they live in, cultures they live in, the healthcare systems they live in, the degree to which they can relate to the therapist, trust the setting, literally the room that they're in to feel comfortable enough to engage in the music intervention, that's all going to seriously impact the response they're having physiologically and neurologically. So this is why these conversations are super important, right? To understand the limitations of even the stuff I've just shared, but ways that we can integrate the information we're learning from the more lab-based world with the realities of the clinical situation. So that's what I've got prepared today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Two really fantastic presentations. And I am so excited to see how many people are attending today for our very first webinar. So please keep posting your questions in the Q&A. And while we wait for some questions for about Dr. Hunt's presentation, if you have any, I did want to read out a question for you, Dr. Roy. It says, thanks for the wonderful presentation. I want to follow up on the above question, which had to do with preferred music. If participants can bring their preferred music to, laboratory experiments, how can we deal with the heterogeneity of those different types of music and explain the effect? So you bring in, patients bring in their own preferred music, but of course that can be very, very different music. So how do you deal with that heterogeneity within an experiment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So maybe it would be useful to understand a little bit more what the person asking the question thinks about, why the heterogeneity would be a problem. But the short answer is we have a control condition where what we do is we take the music and we cut it into little pieces of a few milliseconds and rearrange it at random. So this is what we call the scrambled music condition. And doing that breaks apart the structure of the music, but will leave some of the more superficial acoustic properties of the music. Will leave them unchanged. And so the tests that we run are within subjects. So we compare the individual with himself, using these as control conditions. And so in a sense, this should remove a lot of the problems related with heterogeneity. So we control for those superficial aspects of music that may be subject specific, and we focus on within subject effects. Another thing that I've seen Dr. Zatori do is a little bit more challenging, but what you can do is you can take another participant's preferred music and use it as a control condition for a particular participant. So that could also be a way to control for the heterogeneity of music, such that across the set of participants, the same musical excerpt is used as someone's preferred excerpt and someone else's controlled excerpt. So those are things that we can do. Finally, another study that I had in my slides but didn't present could be to impose a certain musical excerpt, but then measure how much that excerpt is liked by a given participant. And there we would predict stronger effects for excerpts that are most liked by certain participants.
Thank you. And I think that within subject design is a really important thing to keep in mind, in terms of how you set up a design like that to be able to control for that. Another question related to preferred music still, so that clearly hit a chord, right, or struck a chord. Are you aware of any research that looks at preferred participant-selected stimulating music versus preferred participant-selected relaxing music?
No, I'm not aware of any study that has done that, but I think it would be important to do. So combining all of the studies that I've presented, it seems that there may be at least two routes through which music could reduce pain. So one route is through this dopamine effect associated with preferred music, but there also seems to be an advantage for relaxing music, regardless of whether it is preferred or not. And so if it's true that it's really two different routes, then what would be optimal would be self-selected, preferred, and relaxing music. For acute pain. Because chronic pain, may be quite different from acute pain. So acute pain is a high arousal state, so you want to tone it down. Chronic pain is different. So patients may feel tired, depressed, and so maybe for them, more stimulating music might be better. Anyway, a lot of interesting questions to ask.
Yeah, and actually, in one of our future webinars, we'll focus on this whole challenge problem of using acute pain in experimental conditions versus chronic pain. And so this is a real, very important challenge we need to tackle in the kind of mechanistic research that we do, and hopefully through this network can help promote. And I was wondering, I don't have specific, they're coming in the questions, sorry, for Dr. Hunt, and I'll ask the questions. All right, first person says, Dr. Hunt, thank you for a really interesting presentation. Could you please say more about ecologically valid clinical research in music therapy? What are the important considerations for researchers? Is it looking at all of the elements that might influence results, or focusing in on one element like setting or community that might influence the result?
Really great question. I think historically, ecologically valid research has focused not so much on like the community as it has really just literally what's the room that we're collecting the data in, like to what degree is the imaging equipment or the protocol different than what would typically occur during a clinical session. So, if you're trying to do, neuroimaging, for example, with an fMRI machine, that's going to be really, really hard, right? But you might do as much as you can to do as much within that machine situation that's as similar to a music therapy session as possible. So if you improvise with the client, you might come up with a little keyboard and do, but that's not going to be the same, right? So you have to recognize the limitations of the ecology of that. What's nice about EEG, for example, is you can get a portable headset. You can get wireless headsets. You saw even in that photo I showed you with Jörg Faulkner, his therapist and the client, like they're wired up, but they are in a clinical situation. They're in a room full of instruments. It's not a medical setting. They're playing together as if it was just a typical music therapy session. So I think it's an ideal. You're trying to work toward an ideal of doing everything as close as possible to the clinical situation as you can. And I think as we become more aware of the impacts of these other factors, like, systemic trauma, cultural influences, I think we're going to have to start thinking about those facets too. I don't know if that's really been at the heart of anyone's work yet, though.
Thank you. Another question for, I guess, any of you can take this one. Somebody's asking, regarding chronic pain, which do you think are the effects of music in the brain? So maybe the question focuses more on what Dr. Roy just said. We in your studies, Dr. Roy, you've worked with acute experimentally induced pain. Any guess as to what might be going on in the brain in terms of music for chronic pain? And by the way, that future webinar will start delving into that. So make sure to attend that webinar. But any kind of preliminary thoughts about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, one problem with chronic pain is that it's very hard to know what it is associated with in the brain. for all of the reasons that I've mentioned at the beginning, right? So you don't control the pain. So how are you going to look for correlates of the pain at the brain level? So anyway, it's complex, but one of the so far most reliable findings that we've had with respect with chronic pain is that it seems to be related to dysfunction of the brain's reward system. So we can look at the connectivity between different brain regions, and what we find is that patients with chronic pain have more connectivity between two regions of the brain reward system, the nucleus accumbens and the medial prefrontal cortex. And we think that this may be related to the fatigue and the anhedonia that is associated with chronic pain. And what music could do is that through its effects on dopamine and pleasure, music could perhaps reestablish normal functioning of the brain's reward system. So that could be one of the mechanisms.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A question for you, Dr. Hunt. And so again, make sure to keep an eye on our future webinars because that will be addressed in much greater detail in a future webinar. Question for you, Dr. Hunt. How can we honor and balance the patient's needs and unique experiences of music while still maintaining the structure of a research protocol, especially within a control arm to preserve ecological validity? Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the trick, right? So people have been developing flexible research protocols. There is, ways to create a decision tree, for example, working in a clinical situation where, if a client is presenting in these or that ways, then it might affect your way of proceeding with the clinical protocol so that you can, to some degree, respond to patient needs in that situation. And I think mixed methods approaches are also quite good for this too, like Dr. Brett's work. You're not just looking at the quantitative data that's coming out of patient reports, but you're also collecting qualitative data, which might also capture really important information that could reflect on, the validity of the measures you're using and the appropriateness of the measures you're using, so that you can have a protocol like the vocal music therapy where it's it is there is a structure to it, but there is some freedom within that structure that patients can do what they need to do. Maybe that day the group is feeling low energy, and so it is low energy music. And yet the group still did meet. They still did have a group process, and they had that experience together. And so you're measuring then the overall series of sessions where that continued to occur. So, I think there are ways to do it, and there are creative researchers that are working around, creating flexibility within sessions. And then, and it may be that you have to make the hard decision that, this client doesn't need this right now. They need something else. And you have to refer that patient out of the study to get them what they need, because that's the ethical thing to do. And that's okay. But it does mean our research can be slow going sometimes. And so that's why I think we need a lot more people doing research to help us get the information we need.
Thank you. Here's an also interesting question. If a patient is re-exposed to his favorite music a few weeks after a painful episode, so whether it's patient brings in favorite music into a laboratory experiment, and so they now listen to their favorite music but experience pain, or whether it is in a clinical situation where we ask somebody to bring in their favorite music to support them during a painful procedure, for example. The question is, can this patient now associate his music with his pain? Meaning, is there now a connection, or does that music now remind that person of the pain? And so therefore, will there now be a negative emotion associated to that previously favorite music? So what is the risk of ruining a piece of music for the patient, right? I have gotten that question as well when I present. I'm curious what your responses to that is, Dr. Roy or Dr. Hunt. Do you tell patients bring in your preferred piece of music, but preferably one that you don't mind getting ruined by the experiment? I don't know.
Yeah, so this is something that could be the object of a future experiment. So hopefully, I don't think that the kind of pain that we're using in the laboratory is bad enough to change the way that people feel about the music. But this is something that we, should certainly try to test for, say, more severe clinical pain. That's a possibility. So actually, I see two different possibilities. So the first one would be that clockwork orange type of effect that the question seems to imply. So listening to your favorite music while in pain might create an association between the music and the pain and render the music aversive. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that the music could produce a phenomenon akin to conditioned place preference. So in animal models, one way to test the efficacy of a certain treatment for pain is to administer it when the animal is in a certain space of its cage, right? And so you administered morphine or whatever, and when the animal is in that particular place. And if the drug is really producing a relief, the animal will be moving to that place of the cage more often. So that's conditioned place preference. So what could be happening is that the participant is in pain and then listens to his favorite music, which reduces the pain, and learns that the music has pain reducing properties and maybe likes the music even more. So we could make arguments for both types of effects.
That's interesting. Yes, yes. Dr. Hunt, anything to add from a clinical perspective?
I mean, the only thing I was thinking was, well, if you can create a new negative association with that music, you could then just reassociate that music with a positive one, I would imagine, right? Just like you were describing. So, no, I think that's fascinating what Dr. Roy just shared. And so, yeah, you just, you just build upon that complex relationship you have with that music, over time.
Another question, have you considered looking into the relationship between biomarkers, for example, respiratory rate or heart rate, when looking at spontaneous tapping? So that is coming back to the tapping experiment, Dr. Roy, that you presented.
Yeah, we have heart rate data for that experiment that we haven't analyzed. So I'm a little bit new to that whole topic of spontaneous production rate. But I know that some people, well, Wembo's second experiment is looking at the effects of spontaneous production rate on the heart rate of participants, looking for this type of entrainment mechanism. So far, I think, yeah, it's not clear if the heart rate really follows more easily with the spontaneous production rate, but that could certainly be a hypothesis. Another thing that we'd like to do in a future experiment is to use EEG to look at neural oscillations to see if those neural oscillations are more easily entrained by a rhythm that is presented at the spontaneous production rate. There's been studies suggesting that this might be the case. And if it's the case, then the mechanism would be that the brain becomes more in phase with music presented at that particular rhythm, and therefore is no longer or less available for being captured by ascending nociceptive information, because it's locked in, or it's more attuned to the rhythm in the music. So that would be interesting to do. Visiting scholars could do that.
Yes, exactly. Take a chance to or take a look at our visiting scholars opportunity, and I'm sure Dr. Roy could use a lot of your bright minds in his lab with these fantastic questions to design the next series of experiments. There's one last question, I believe, that remained unanswered. I don't know, there's a few. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to all of them, but some research has demonstrated that some populations with pain, such as people with sickle cell disease, exhibit different neural connections related to pain compared to healthy populations. Curious how we can generalize neural mechanisms of pain from music intervention studies of healthy volunteers, given these differences. And it's interesting, that question, because actually in the application that we wrote for this for funding for this network, that is one of the questions or one of the recommendations that I made in the application, that, you know, it's great that we're doing all these laboratory experiments and they're really important, but we do need to remember that they are with healthy volunteers, and it is important to also move the work towards doing these experiments with clinical populations, or at least seriously looking at, you know, what is the impact, what can be translatable to clinical populations. Yes, I'm wondering what you think about that question.
Yeah. So, well, it's a good question. As we discussed, there may be many differences between chronic and acute pain, and in addition to that, many differences between many chronic pain conditions. And as I said, we still don't really know what's the impact of chronic pain on the brain. There's been many studies, but we need more higher powered studies to really know what is reliable. But at the same time, you know, acute pain is also an important problem. So it is a part of many medical procedures, dental procedures, little surgeries, etc., that could benefit from music. And I think that laboratory pain is a good model of that. But for chronic pain, eventually we'll have to move more towards chronic pain, either by studying patients directly with music, and then we would need sufficiently funded projects, because it's more challenging and more costly. Or we could also use pain models that are kind of in between. So one idea we've been playing with is to look at delayed onset muscle soreness. So the pain you feel, you know, 48 hours after intense training when your body aches. Or more prolonged pain produced by capsaicin or other models.
Thank you. Did you want to add something, Dr. Hunt?
No, just other than, you know, I think it would be wonderful if we had the way, you know, we could get patient populations to different groups and look at things like fibromyalgia pain versus, you know, sickle cell versus orthopedic pain, like, you know, because there must be, I mean, look, just knowing that there is a difference with sickle cell pain compared to these other healthy populations. And absolutely, we should work with patients. It's going to be another challenge ethically to work with patients in a way that can meet their needs and to get the numbers we need, you know, in typical, you know, neuroscience research to know what works well. So whether it's a waitlist control group or something, that people get the interventions that might be beneficial to them. But I think it would be wonderful, if we could get the funding and the people power to do it.
Yeah, and there are actually a couple of interesting studies with people with fibromyalgia, you know, experimental studies. So you can certainly Google for those. Those are definitely out there. So with that, we have come to the end of our inaugural webinar, and I see that our wonderful research network coordinator, Fatima, has put up the slide for our next webinar. We had a date, and then something happened. And so we're working hard on identifying a new date. It will likely be the first week of December, but keep an eye on our website for the announcement of that webinar. You can see there's some really exciting speakers that will be joining us for that webinar as well. Dr. Roy and Dr. Hunt, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. These presentations were truly fantastic, fascinating, and inspiring. And I think will just give us a lot of food for thought for the kind of studies that we want to design hopefully give people also some ideas for maybe applying to our pilot funding that becomes available every year through this network and the other music research networks that the NIH is funding. The current cycle just closed, but please know that every year a call will come out for pilot funding. And so some of these ideas that were discussed here or questions that were raised would be, perfect designs for getting some pilot funding so that then you are successful in applying for NIH funding. So thank you all for your attendance. This webinar was recorded and will be posted just as will future webinars on our website. So keep an eye out there for our future webinars as well. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.